The overhead lights buzzed faintly as Emily Parker stepped onto the dimly lit pediatric floor. The quiet always settled heavy on her shoulders this time of night. Not eerie, just expectant, like the whole ward was holding its breath. She clocked in, clipped her ID badge to her scrubs, and tucked her stethoscope into her coat pocket. Another 12 hours, another round of night shift quiet, IV checks, whispered lullabies, and machines blinking softly in the dark. The children were asleep, most of them at least. A few stirred occasionally, caught in dreams or discomfort. Emily moved between rooms like a ghost, adjusting blankets, checking vitals, smoothing damp curls off warm foreheads. The military hospital had its routines, just like she did. Most of the kids here were the sons and daughters of soldiers, some recovering from surgery, others just passing through during a parent's deployment. The pediatric wing didn't see much action after 9 p.m., but Emily liked it that way. It gave her space to breathe, to care without the noise. Tonight, though, something felt different. When she glanced at the roster, a new name blinked at her from the bottom of the list. Liam, age 7. No last name, no family contact listed. Transferred in late that afternoon. Room 409. She frowned. No intake notes, no allergies listed. Just a short comment from the attending physician. Quiet. No verbal communication yet. Emily moved down the hall, her steps soft on the linoleum. Room 409 was at the end, next to the storage closet. She pushed the door open slowly. The boy sat upright in bed, knees drawn to his chest, arms wrapped tight around them. His eyes flicked to hers but didn't stay long. A hospital-issue blanket was pulled tight around his shoulders, his small body barely making a dent in the mattress. The only sound in the room was the steady beep of the monitor and the soft, nervous rustling of sheets. "Hi, sweetheart," Emily said gently. "I'm Nurse Emily. I'll be with you tonight." No response. She didn't press him. Kids talked when they were ready, or sometimes they never did. She'd learned long ago that forcing comfort never worked. Instead, she pulled the visitor's chair up beside the bed and sat quietly, folding her hands in her lap. The boy didn't look at her again, but he didn't ask her to leave either. Minutes passed, then an hour. Emily stayed. Around 2 a.m., she thought she heard him whisper something, but when she looked up, his eyes were closed, face turned to the wall. By dawn, she'd barely moved. When her replacement arrived, she left a note on the bedside table. "He doesn't talk, but he listens. Just sit with him." As she walked toward the elevator, Emily knew something had started that night. Not with words, but with presence. Room 409 had always been one of the quieter ones, tucked at the far end of the hallway where the vending machines hummed and the emergency exit sign flickered every few minutes. But that night, the silence felt heavier, as though it belonged to the boy inside rather than the room itself. Liam was small for 7, bones too sharp beneath pale skin, hair cut unevenly like someone had tried to do it themselves in a hurry. He sat on the bed cross-legged, a coloring book unopened on his lap, a pencil untouched beside it. His eyes, an unflinching gray, tracked Emily as she stepped in. They were wide, not in fear, but in watchfulness. Not a sound escaped him. "Hey there, Liam," she said softly, trying not to let her concern show. "Mind if I hang out for a while?" He didn't nod, didn't shake his head. Just blinked once, then looked past her like he was staring through the wall. Emily sat anyway, easing into the same chair she'd used the night before. The boy hadn't moved much since then, and she wondered if he'd slept at all. She read through his file again, what little there was of it. No allergies, no known medical history, no emergency contact. Just a vague transfer note from another hospital, and a temporary hold order signed by someone with a high-level clearance she didn't recognize. It made her uneasy. Kids didn't just show up without someone to call. When she gently asked him if he was hungry, there was no answer. But she noticed the smallest shift. His eyes flicked toward the tray she'd brought in earlier, the untouched sandwich now curling at the edges. Without a word, she opened the drawer beside his bed and pulled out a small pack of crackers. She peeled the plastic back halfway and set it on the table beside him. Still nothing. She wasn't expecting a thank you. She just didn't want him to feel forgotten. He reached for the crackers 5 minutes after she turned away. That was something. The hours passed like that. Quiet, slow, unspoken. Liam didn't speak, didn't cry. But when a loud voice echoed from the hallway, he flinched so hard his legs nearly kicked the tray over. Emily moved quickly, steadying the table before crouching beside him. "You're safe here," she whispered, her hand hovering near his arm, but not touching it. "I promise." For the first time, he looked directly at her. His expression didn't soften, but something in it cracked, just a little. Enough for her to see the fear he was trying so hard to hide. Emily sat back in the chair. She didn't press further. If room 409 was going to be his shelter, she'd make sure it stayed that way. The first real moment between them came during rounds, when Emily nearly dropped her pen. It hit the floor with a sharp clatter, and in the time it took for the sound to echo off the walls, Liam had already pressed himself back against the headboard, fists clenched in the blanket, eyes wide like a deer that had learned to run before it learned to trust. Emily bent to retrieve the pen, moving slowly, deliberately. "Sorry, buddy," she said in a soft voice, as though speaking too loudly might shatter him. "Didn't mean to scare you." He didn't reply, just stared at the floor like it might open up and swallow him whole. Emily didn't push. She finished her checks in silence, jotting notes on his vitals, watching his heart rate spike and gradually settle on the monitor beside the bed. She noticed the way he sat, shoulders slightly hunched, hands always within reach of the blanket. A small protective barrier he could pull up at any second. His eyes scanned everything, the door, the windows, the nurse's cart outside. It was the look of someone who had learned to read a room not for comfort, but for threats. Later that night, when she returned to sit beside him, she brought a book, not to read to him. She'd learned quickly that too much talking only made him tense again, but to simply have something in her lap while she kept him company. It gave him permission to ignore her if he wanted to, which he did, until the page she turned made a slight tearing sound. He flinched again, smaller this time, but enough. Emily closed the book. "Loud sounds bother you, huh?" she asked gently. Still, no answer. But he looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Not past her, not through her. Just a steady, uncertain gaze that lingered for 3 full seconds before he dropped it again. That was the first night she started whispering, even when no one else was around. She kept her movements slow, her voice low, her presence constant. She turned off the overhead light and brought in a small lamp from the break room, its yellow glow soft and steady. When nurses in the hallway laughed too loudly, she gently closed the door. Liam didn't speak, not even in sleep. But by the end of the week, he no longer flinched when she entered the room. That was progress in her world, measured not in words spoken or questions answered, but in the absence of fear. Sometimes silence was a story in itself, and Emily was learning to read it, one quiet moment at a time. Emily found the first drawing tucked under Liam's pillow when she came in to fluff it. She didn't mean to invade his space, just part of the routine, but the corner of the paper poked out, folded unevenly and creased like it had been handled too many times. She paused, eyes scanning his face. He was watching her from beneath his lashes, tense but still. "Is this yours?" she asked, holding it gently between two fingers. Liam didn't answer, but he didn't pull away either. That was enough. She unfolded the paper slowly. It was a pencil sketch, rough but precise. A small boy standing in the corner of a room, windows high above him. No door. The shading made the walls feel heavy, like they were closing in. And in the middle of the page, drawn faintly, almost as an afterthought, was a chair. Empty. Emily sat down beside his bed and studied it again. "Is this how you feel sometimes?" she asked. A beat passed. Then Liam gave the smallest nod, barely more than the tilt of his head, but it was something. His fingers fidgeted in his lap. Emily didn't push. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notepad, the kind she used to keep medication reminders. She tore off a few blank sheets and placed them on his tray table. Then a pencil. "No pressure," she said. "But if it helps, draw." From that night on, the drawings kept coming. Not every shift, not on command, but quietly, almost like gifts left behind for her to find. Some were fragments, half-finished rooms, sad stick figures, swirling shadows. Others were strangely detailed. A pair of boots near a door, a crumpled bed, a helmet with a star insignia. Each one was a puzzle, and Emily treated them like holy things. She never called attention to them, never asked for more. But when Liam noticed she had gently taped one to her clipboard instead of throwing it away, something changed. The next night, he handed her one directly. It showed a nurse sitting beside a bed, a small figure in the bed, eyes closed. No words, no color, just lines that felt tender in a way no child should have learned so young. Emily smiled. "That's me, huh?" Liam didn't look up, but she swore his lips curved, just barely. He still hadn't spoken, but his silence was no longer empty. It was full of pictures, full of meaning. And in those small pages of pencil lines, she saw the voice of a boy learning to trust the world again, one drawing at a time. It started as something small, just a chair pulled beside the bed, angled slightly so she wasn't looming. No clipboard, no checking vitals, just sitting. The first night she stayed for 10 minutes, the second, 20. By the end of the week, it had become routine. Emily would begin her shift with a quiet walk down the hall, nod to the other nurses, and stop at room 409. Liam would be waiting, never at the window or watching the TV, but in bed, legs pulled close, a pencil in his hand. He rarely acknowledged her arrival, but when she didn't come right away, his eyes would flick to the door every few seconds. She noticed that, even if he pretended not to. She started bringing things. A small flashlight to help him trace shadows on the ceiling when he couldn't sleep. A sketchbook, slowly filling with quiet drawings he never explained. One night she brought a book, no words, just pictures, and flipped through it with him, page by page. His fingers hovered near the illustrations like he was memorizing them. She never asked questions. Not about the shadows in his sketches or the way he flinched when someone dropped a tray in the hallway. Emily knew some children carried their stories deep, buried under silence thick as armor. Her job wasn't to dig. It was to sit beside the armor until it didn't feel so necessary. Sometimes they sat for hours, the only sound the hum of machines and the low rhythm of beeping monitors. He drew. She watched or read quietly. They never spoke. But there was a comfort in that silence, a shared understanding that didn't need to be named. One night, when the ward was especially still, Liam reached into his blanket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. He didn't hand it to her, just placed it on the edge of the table and slid it forward. It was a simple sketch, 2 stick figures side by side. one with a long ponytail, the other smaller, with a blanket around his shoulders. Above them, a single word written in shaky, uneven letters. Safe. Emily didn't say anything, just placed her hand gently on the table beside the drawing and gave a quiet nod. That night, when she stood to leave, Liam looked at her, really looked, and gave the tiniest wave. Not out of obligation, just enough to say, "I see you too." And so the pattern formed, a chair, a presence, silence that felt less lonely. Two people, night after night, proving that sometimes being there is everything. The pediatric ward kept a log for every child, a list of who came and went, when parents visited, when a sibling dropped by with a crayon drawing or a stuffed animal still smelling like home. Emily glanced at Liam's log out of habit during her shift one night, eyes skimming down the page. What she saw made her stomach clench. Empty. No mother, no father, no aunt or neighbor, not even a social worker logged in since his first day. She double-checked, thinking maybe a name had been missed or scribbled hastily in a margin. But the columns remained clean. Too clean. She glanced through the doorway of room 409. Liam was sitting cross-legged again, sketching carefully, his tongue peeking out in concentration. The soft light from the corner lamp highlighted the bruises under his eyes, faint, like echoes of bad sleep. No child goes untouched by absence. Emily knew that. Some kids cried for their parents until they ran out of breath. Some grew angry. But Liam, he just folded inward, like no one was coming and he'd known it from the start. That night, Emily stayed longer than usual. After vitals and rounds, after the hallway lights dimmed, she brought in 2 cups of warm milk. She placed one on his bedside tray. He looked at it, then at her. "Don't worry," she said. "It's not medicine, just warm." Liam hesitated, then reached for the cup with both hands. She sat beside him, sipping from hers in silence. After a few minutes, she spoke without looking at him. "You know, most of the kids here have people dropping in. Parents, friends, sometimes even dogs, therapy ones. But it's okay if you don't. It's not your fault." He didn't react right away. But then his grip on the cup tightened, and he slowly placed it back on the tray, half full. Emily watched the motion, noting how deliberate it was. Like every move he made had to be measured, controlled. She wondered what kind of 7-year-old learns to live like that. The next day, she asked the charge nurse if there had been a mix-up, if Liam's visitors had been redirected or forgotten in a paperwork mess. The response was a shrug and a quiet reply. "We were told to keep him isolated. No contact. Orders from higher up." Emily didn't know what that meant exactly, but she knew how it felt. That night, when she pulled the chair up beside Liam's bed, he didn't wait for her to speak. He held out a drawing, 2 figures again. One of them with a name badge drawn on her chest, the other smaller, blanket-wrapped. Above them was a window, a dark one, but inside the room, the light was on. Emily didn't need words to understand. In a world where no one had come for him, Liam had noticed she always did. It was during a routine midnight check, the kind she'd done 100 times before, when Emily noticed something she hadn't seen before. Liam had drifted into a light sleep, his breathing soft and uneven, the sketchbook still open on his chest. She reached gently to remove it so he wouldn't roll onto it in his sleep, and that's when she saw them. Faint, yellowing bruises along his forearm, just beneath the sleeve of his hospital gown. Her breath caught, not because they were fresh, but because they weren't. These were the kind that came from weeks of pressure, not accidents. Not the kind of bruises kids got from playground falls or clumsy tumbles. She didn't touch him, just looked. And then, as she adjusted the blanket higher on his chest, She saw what his hand was gripping beneath the folds. A patch, frayed around the edges, fingers curled around it like it was a lifeline. She eased it loose, just enough to see the details. Olive drab with bold, faded embroidery. A star, an eagle, special forces insignia. Emily blinked, her mind reeling. Kids didn't carry things like this for fun. This was something a soldier wore, not something handed out like candy. Liam stirred slightly, his fingers reaching instinctively when he felt it shift. She handed it back without hesitation. "It's okay," she whispered. "You can hold on to it." He clutched it tighter, hugging it to his chest like a shield. His eyes fluttered open briefly, saw her face, then closed again, not in fear, but in a quiet surrender, as if saying, "You saw it. You know, but don't ask." Emily sat down beside him, her mind spinning. Who was this boy? Whose patch was that? And more importantly, why had no one come looking for him? The bruises, the silence, the orders to isolate. It all pointed to something bigger, something kept behind locked doors and clipped conversations. She stayed the rest of the night without leaving the room. And when Liam woke again, sometime before dawn, he didn't speak. But he opened his hand just slightly, holding out the patch for her to see. Not to give it to her, just to let her know. This mattered. This was part of the story he couldn't tell. Emily nodded slowly. She didn't need the whole truth to know the boy in room 4. 09 wasn't just scared. He was surviving something. And in his silence, in his bruises, in the way he never let go of that patch, she understood more than words could ever explain. Emily had always trusted the charts. In a place like this, where protocols were king and every patient came with a paper trail, charts were supposed to tell the truth, clean, chronological, indisputable. But Liam's didn't. It nagged at her, the way a loose thread in a uniform does. Every time she walked past the nurse's station, her eyes drifted toward the thin blue folder labeled 409, Liam, Peds. It looked normal, unremarkable. But Emily knew better now. Late one night, when the ward was still and the monitors blinked in rhythm like distant stars, she slipped the folder from the rack and brought it to the corner desk. Just a peek, she told herself. Not to pry. To protect. She flipped through the pages. Vitals, check-ins, medication logs, all standard. But there were pieces missing. No birth date, no parental information. In the emergency contact field, a single line had been drawn through the box, as if someone had decided, after filling it in, that the answer should be none. Her fingers hovered over the line. No one had flagged it. No one had asked. She turned to the intake report. It listed a transfer from another facility, but the hospital name was coded, not written out. There was a signature, an officer's name, half legible, but no department stamp. No attending physician noted for initial assessment. Just a generic line. Admitted under restricted protocol. Emily stared at the words, her heart sinking. She flipped again, this time to the social services note. Blank. A space that should have included evaluations, background info, custody status. All missing. And then, at the very back, a single note clipped to the chart. Hold for further clearance. No inquiries. It wasn't signed. Emily leaned back in her chair. This wasn't just an oversight. This was intentional. Someone didn't want questions asked. Someone didn't want Liam's past examined too closely. She thought of the bruises, the patch, the way he curled into himself at the smallest sound, how he never asked for anything, never expected anything. Like a child who had learned not just to survive alone, but to hide in plain sight. She closed the file slowly, carefully sliding it back into the rack. No alarms, No confrontations. Just the quiet confirmation that something about Liam's story had been erased before anyone could read it. But she had seen enough. From that night on, Emily stopped looking for answers in the paperwork. She started looking at the boy himself, his drawings, his silences, his eyes, which sometimes held more truth than any file ever could. And deep down, she made a promise. Even if no one else had written his story down, she would remember every page of it. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Emily stepped into the supply room to grab extra blankets. The hallway was dim, quiet except for the low whir of machines and the occasional squeak of a cart's wheel. As she reached for the top shelf, she heard voices drifting from the break room just across the corridor. 2 doctors speaking low, but not low enough. She paused, hidden behind the half-closed door. "Kid in 409, one of them said. "Still no update from command." Emily's heart ticked faster. "I don't even know why they dropped him here," the second voice replied. "We're a hospital, not a safe house. If he's part of an ongoing investigation, he shouldn't be in pediatrics." There was a pause, then a heavy sigh. "Classified custody," they said, "which means no questions, not even from us." Emily held her breath. The term hung in the air like smoke. Classified custody. It sounded more like a military holding than anything involving a child. She couldn't imagine using those words in the same sentence as a 7-year-old, but here they were, spoken without hesitation. "What about his parents?" the first asked. A rustle of papers. No official guardianship on file. The mother's MIA, presumed left the country. The father, well, there's a lot of red tape. Special forces, last we heard. Operation status sealed. Could be dead. Could be deployed. Emily pressed her back against the wall, a cold knot forming in her chest. "He shouldn't be alone in there," the first voice murmured, a little softer. "Poor kid looks like he hasn't been hugged in months." The other responded, tone resigned. "We're just supposed to keep him alive and quiet until someone above our pay grade figures out what to do with him." A chair scraped. Footsteps moved toward the door. Emily ducked back into the supply room just as they stepped out, keeping her breath slow, quiet. She didn't move until the footsteps faded completely. When she finally returned to room 409, Liam was still awake, curled in his blanket like usual, eyes barely visible in the dim glow of the lamp. She sat down beside him, heart heavy with what she now knew. He wasn't just abandoned. He was hidden. Forgotten not by accident, but by design. Emily didn't say a word. She just stayed close, like always, pretending everything outside that room didn't exist. But her silence was different now. No longer just comfort, it was defiance. A quiet promise. If the world was going to bury Liam's truth, she'd be the one to remember it. The idea came to her suddenly, while she was walking past the hospital gift shop during her break. Tucked in the corner of the display, half buried behind glittery balloons and get-well cards, was a small, gray stuffed dog with floppy ears and a crooked tail. It wasn't fancy. The stitching along its back was a little off, and one button eye was slightly bigger than the other. But it looked like something a child might hold tight when the world felt too big. Emily bought it without thinking twice. That night, just after midnight rounds, she entered room 409 with the little dog tucked under her arm. Liam was sketching again, crouched over his notebook like always, pencil tapping lightly against the paper. She didn't announce it, didn't try to make it a moment. Instead, she walked over, set the stuffed animal gently at the foot of his bed, and said, "Found this guy looking for a home. Thought maybe he could hang out with you." Then she sat in her usual chair, opened a book, and let the silence settle. For a while, nothing happened. Liam didn't touch the toy, didn't acknowledge it. Emily didn't look at him either, pretending to be lost in her reading. But out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the smallest shift, his hand reaching forward. The pencil paused. His fingers brushed the dog's fur, and then, slowly, carefully, he pulled it closer, held it in both hands, studying it like it might vanish. His thumb grazed the lopsided ear. A moment passed, then another, and then, like a sunbeam slipping through a crack, he smiled. It wasn't big or obvious. It didn't come with laughter or a gleam in his eye, but it was real. The corners of his mouth lifted just slightly, and for the first time, the lines of tension that always clung to his face softened. His guard for a flicker of a second lowered. Emily didn't say anything. She just smiled too, quietly, from behind her book. Liam didn't speak that night, but when it was time for her to go, he placed the stuffed dog carefully on the pillow beside him, patting it once like he was tucking it in. As she reached the door, he glanced up, just for a second, and gave her a look she hadn't seen before. Not fear, not mistrust, something closer to hope. That little gray dog stayed by his side from then on, and Emily knew, without asking, that smile wasn't just about a toy. It was about being seen. Emily found it just before sunrise, folded neatly on her chair the way someone might leave a thank you note. At first, she thought it was one of her paperwork sheets, misplaced in the shuffle of a long shift. But when she unfolded it, her breath caught. It was a drawing, done in soft pencil, the lines still smudged from where small fingers had pressed too hard. Two figures stood in the center of the page. One tall, one small. The taller one wore what was unmistakably scrubs, complete with a drawn-on name badge and what looked like a stethoscope, looped awkwardly over one shoulder. The smaller figure had a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, just like Liam always did. They were holding hands. Emily stared at it for a long time. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were off, and the hands were shaped like tiny clouds. But none of that mattered. Because what Liam had drawn wasn't just art. It was trust. He hadn't given it to her directly. That wasn't his way. But he'd left it out for her to find. A silent gesture louder than any words he'd never spoken. She looked over to where he slept, curled around his stuffed dog, his breathing slow and steady. The pencil he'd used was still on the tray table, its tip dulled from effort. He hadn't drawn this for himself. He'd drawn it for her. For a moment, the weight of it was too much. Not in a sad way, just overwhelming in its simplicity. The drawing said what Liam never had. "You make me feel safe." Emily folded the paper again, carefully this time, and slipped it into the inside pocket of her scrub jacket. She would never lose it. This wasn't just a picture. It was a turning point. Later that morning, as nurses changed shifts and the ward began to stir with light and movement, Liam blinked awake. She was still beside him, sipping coffee, trying not to look too emotional. He glanced at her pocket, then back at her face. She nodded once, a small smile on her lips. "I loved it," she said quietly. He didn't smile this time, but he didn't look away either. And in that shared stillness, something settled between them, an understanding without words, drawn not with ink or explanation, but with the quiet bravery of a child who had learned to speak with pictures. The ward was quiet again. The night had settled like a heavy blanket, and most of the children were asleep, their monitors casting a soft glow against the walls. Emily sat beside Liam as always, but tonight her mind wandered. She watched him trace the outline of the stuffed dog's ear with his thumb, and felt something stir in her chest, a memory she hadn't touched in years. She used to be him, not in this exact bed, not in this exact hospital. But the fear, the silence, the ache of waiting for someone who might never come back, that part she knew too well. She was 8 the last time she saw her father. He wore his uniform like it was a second skin, kissed her forehead with sandpaper stubble, and promised he'd be home by Christmas. He never made it to Thanksgiving. They told her it was quick, an ambush. A flag-folded funeral followed, all crisp uniforms and solemn words she couldn't understand. What came after was a blur, her mother unraveling, the hospital visits when panic attacks took over, nights where Emily sat in waiting rooms that smelled like bleach and fear, holding a toy rabbit missing one eye. No one explained things. People spoke over her, around her. She learned to be quiet, to not need, to hold it all inside. She didn't speak much back then either. Years later, nursing school gave her structure. Healing others became her way of stitching together the holes in her own story. But sometimes, in rooms like this, with children like Liam, the past came back, not to haunt her, but to remind her. That's why she stayed, why she didn't ask too many questions, why she understood that sometimes a soft voice and a consistent presence were more powerful than answers. Because once, long ago, someone had sat beside her too. A nurse named Carla, who brought her juice in paper cups and told her bedtime stories without expecting a smile. Now it was her turn. She looked at Liam, who had finally dozed off with his hand still resting on the stuffed animal. His face looked softer in sleep, the worry lines eased. She brushed a piece of hair from his forehead and whispered so low it was more for herself than for him. "I know, buddy. I really do." And in that moment, the hospital didn't feel quite so cold. The distance between past and present blurred. And Emily Parker, who had once been a child sitting alone in the dark, now sat as a light in someone else's. The next morning, Emily didn't even wait for the coffee to finish brewing in the break room. She walked straight to the charge nurse's office, Liam's incomplete chart tucked under her arm and a knot of anger tightening in her chest. She didn't plan a speech. She didn't need one. "Something's wrong," she said, setting the file down in front of Margaret, head nurse, by the book, and as unshakable as the walls of the hospital. "This boy has no emergency contact, no social worker assigned, no legal guardian. He's just here, alone." Margaret looked up from her computer, her brow rising. "You're not cleared to review custodial information, Emily." "I'm cleared to care for patients," Emily replied, not backing down. "And that includes advocating for ones who can't speak for themselves." There was a pause, the kind that told her she was brushing up against something bigger than she realized. Finally, Margaret leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "This situation is being handled at a higher level. Military custody, special authorization. We were told explicitly, no outside involvement. So we're just supposed to ignore the fact that a 7-year-old is being hidden in our pediatric ward with no guardian and no explanation." Emily's voice stayed low, but the edge in it sharpened. Margaret's eyes softened just slightly, but her tone didn't change. "Emily, I know you care, but there are channels, and stepping out of line on something like this could end your career." Emily stood there for a long second, long enough for the words to settle. Career, protocol, classified. But none of those words sat heavier than the image of Liam clutching that frayed military patch, curled beneath a blanket like it was armor. She left without saying another word. That night she sat beside his bed again. She didn't bring it up. She didn't let her frustration show. But she was different now, more aware of the barriers in place, the walls she hadn't seen until she tried to move through them. And as Liam silently pushed a new drawing toward her, a hospital room, the same chair, and now a tiny window with sunlight peeking through, she realized something. They might not want her involved, but she already was. Not because it was her job, because he was a child, because she knew what it felt like to be forgotten in the margins of someone else's rules, and because, red tape or not, She wasn't leaving. The hospital hummed with its usual nighttime rhythm, soft monitors blinking, muffled footsteps down the corridor, distant murmurs from the nurses' station. Emily sat beside Liam's bed, as she always did, watching over him as he drew slow, sleepy circles on the corner of his blanket with one finger. He'd been quieter than usual that night. Not withdrawn, just tired in a different way. The kind of tired that came from carrying too much for too long. His sketchbook lay closed on the table. The stuffed dog rested near his pillow, its crooked tail tucked neatly beneath his chin. Emily didn't say much, just sat and read a few lines of a worn paperback, glancing up every now and then to make sure he was still drifting. Around 2 a.m., his breathing deepened. One hand fell open on the blanket, the other curled gently under his cheek. Emily watched him sleep, her thoughts a tangle of memories and questions, so many questions no one seemed willing to answer. Then she heard it. Barely more than a whisper, a single word, fragile and cracked as dry leaves. "Daddy." Emily froze. It wasn't spoken to her. It wasn't even fully formed. But it was there, breathed out between dreams like a secret finally too heavy to keep inside. Her heart ached at the sound of it. Not because of what it revealed, but because of how much it cost him to say it, even unconsciously. She leaned forward slightly, watching his face. There were no tears, no change in expression. Just a tiny crease between his brows, as though, even in sleep, the loss lived there. She reached out and gently brushed her fingers along the back of his hand. Not enough to wake him, just enough to let him know he wasn't alone. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered. "I know." It was the first word he'd spoken since arriving. Not to a doctor, not during a checkup, not even to her. But it was a beginning, a crack in the silence, a name spoken not in fear, but in longing. And though he would never remember saying it, Emily would, because it told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't just scared. He was waiting for someone who might never come home. And now she was no longer just a nurse on the night shift. She was the witness to a truth no one else had heard. Emily hadn't planned to cross that line. She knew the rules, knew the thin line between concern and interference in a military hospital. But rules had never met a child like Liam. And after hearing that single word whispered in the dark, she couldn't unhear it. Couldn't ignore the soft, broken "daddy" that clung to her chest long after her shift ended. The patch had stayed in her mind, burned there. Olive green, Special Forces insignia, worn and clutched like a lifeline. Liam never let it out of reach. It wasn't just a token, it was a link to someone he still believed in. So, during a rare lull in her next shift, Emily took a calculated risk. She found an empty computer at the admin desk, typed quietly, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. She wasn't hacking into anything, just using the same military personnel lookup system available to hospital staff for identification confirmation. She told herself it was about medical necessity, about understanding his file better. But deep down, she knew it was something else. She entered the visible digits from the patch's edge. There had been a name. Thompson. Common, yes. But paired with Special Forces and missing parent, it narrowed the field. Dozens of names came up. She scanned quickly, eyes catching on one. Master Sergeant James Thompson, Army Special Forces, deployed 8 months ago, declared MIA during a classified mission overseas. Her breath hitched. She clicked the name. The file wasn't detailed, most of it redacted, but a few pieces aligned. Last known residence near Fort Carson. A wife listed, but marked as location unknown. One dependent, no follow-up contact. Emily leaned back in the chair, the pieces snapping into place like a puzzle she'd been working on in the dark. Liam wasn't just a forgotten child. He was the son of a missing soldier, and whatever had happened to his mother, it had left him utterly alone. Classified custody, ongoing investigation, no one asking questions because no one wanted to know the answers. Emily closed the window and logged out. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the weight of it settle on her like armor. He wasn't supposed to be her problem. But now she knew, and knowing meant responsibility. Later that night, she brought Liam a new box of pencils. He took them without a word but offered her a small sketch in return. It was a drawing of a soldier, handsome, tall, with a child next to him. They were both smiling. It was hopeful, painfully so. Emily tucked it into her pocket and smiled softly. She didn't know how to find his father, but she would never stop fighting to make sure someone did. Emily had seen a lot in her years of nursing: grief, trauma, resilience in all its quiet forms. But nothing had ever felt as heavy as the weight of the truth she now carried. It began with that one name, Master Sergeant James Thompson. After the late-night search, the pieces had begun to assemble themselves. She spent her next day off reading between redacted lines, digging through public archives, press releases, and veterans' forms. Anything that might hint at who Liam's father truly was. It didn't take long to realize he wasn't just any soldier. James Thompson was a decorated Special Operations Commander, one of the Army's most respected operatives, though most of his work never made the news. Special Forces, multiple deployments, missions sealed under layers of classification. The kind of man whose photo showed up in medal ceremonies, then disappeared from public view when the work turned quiet and dangerous. His name appeared in a single article from 6 months ago. A mission gone sideways, hostile territory, no confirmed remains, no retrieval. Declared MIA. Emily stared at the screen for a long time, heart sinking with every word. MIA didn't mean dead, but it didn't mean coming home either. No wonder no one had come for Liam. No wonder the file had so many blanks. The military hadn't forgotten him. They just didn't know what to do with a boy whose future was entangled in silence. She remembered Liam's whispered, "Daddy." The way he held that patch like it was sacred. He hadn't just been abandoned. He was waiting for someone the world had already started to mourn in quiet, classified ways. Emily closed her laptop and sat in silence for a long time. What haunted her wasn't just the tragedy of it. It was how easily a child could disappear into the cracks of a system that prized secrecy over humanity. No flag-draped ceremony for Liam, no school counselor, just a hospital bed and a nurse who cared too much. That night she returned to room 409 with something new in her chest. Not pity, not even grief. Resolve. Liam sat curled against the wall, sketching with soft focus. When she entered, he didn't look up right away. But when he did, she gave him the gentlest smile. "I know about your dad," she said softly, kneeling beside him. He froze. His pencil stopped moving. His eyes searched hers. "He was brave," she continued. "Still is, wherever he is." Liam didn't speak, but he reached for the patch, held it up between them, and nodded once. That was all the confirmation she needed. They might have labeled his father as presumed missing, but in Liam's heart, he was still out there. And now, in that small hospital room no one was supposed to notice, Emily silently vowed he wouldn't wait alone anymore. The call came just after 4 a.m., crackling through the landline at the front desk like a voice from another world. The night clerk, a college student who usually spent her shifts scrolling through her phone, straightened in her chair the moment the caller said, "This is a secured military channel. Patch me to the on-duty charge nurse immediately." Emily had just stepped out of room 409, a half-empty cup of coffee in hand, when Margaret's voice echoed down the hall, sharp, urgent. "Emily, my office, now!" She entered the office, the fluorescent light too harsh for the hour. Margaret hung up the phone with a tight motion and didn't sit. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands trembled slightly, a detail Emily didn't miss. "That call was from Fort Bragg," Margaret said, each word clipped. "They didn't give names, but they said we're to prepare for an incoming VIP transfer, classified." Emily's pulse quickened. "A patient?" Margaret shook her head. "Number an escort, military, high clearance, coming here, to this floor." Emily felt the shift in the air like a pressure drop before a storm. The only patient here with a file that wasn't entirely his own was Liam. "They didn't say his name," Margaret added, softer now. "But they mentioned a minor in protective medical care. That's Liam." Emily gripped the back of the chair in front of her. "Do they know where his father is?" "They didn't say. Only that someone important is en route, and that hospital staff are to remain on standby and limit movement." She understood the subtext immediately. No questions, no speculation. Eyes open, mouth shut. When Emily returned to room 409, Liam was awake. He sat upright, eyes already on the door, as if he had felt the shift too. The air buzzed differently now. There was something waiting just beyond the edge of the morning. She walked to his side and knelt, keeping her voice low. "Someone's coming." He didn't ask who, didn't speak at all. But the way his shoulders lifted, the way he held the patch tighter in his hands, it told her everything. Hope was dangerous, but tonight it was alive in him again. Emily reached for the small stuffed dog, smoothing its ears as a cover for the emotion rising in her throat. She didn't know who was coming. She didn't know what they would say. But something had changed. The silence that had guarded Liam for so long was cracking. And on the other side of it, someone was finally reaching back. Emily's shift ended at 7 a.m., as it always did. Nurses clocked out, day staff filtered in, and the usual chatter of morning reports filled the air like a hum of routine. But Emily didn't leave. She sat beside Liam, the soft morning light spilling through the window, bathing his room in a warm haze that almost made the place feel like home. He hadn't said anything since the mysterious call the night before, but his hands were restless, folding and unfolding the corner of his blanket, his gaze never straying far from the door. The official line was clear: classified arrival, standby protocol, minimal staff involvement. But no one had said Emily had to leave. And more importantly, no one had said Liam should face whatever came next alone. So she stayed. She removed her badge, untied her scrub top, and tucked her clipboard away, making herself invisible to the day shift. She wasn't there as a nurse now. She was there as something more difficult to define. A guardian in plain clothes. A steady presence in a life that had known far too few. She helped him choose a fresh t-shirt from the donated clothing drawer, combed his hair gently with her fingers, and wiped a smudge of pencil from his cheek without making it a moment. Liam allowed it all in silence, the same way he allowed her to be there. As the hours stretched, so did her resolve. The whispers on the ward grew. Unmarked vehicles had entered the staff lot. An officer had checked in at the front desk, credentials sealed in a black folder. But Emily didn't ask questions. She didn't need details. She could see it in Liam's posture, tight, alert, coiled in hope and dread. And so she did what she always had. She sat in the chair, close but not too close, letting him feel her presence like a hand on his back without needing to touch. By late afternoon, another nurse gently tapped her shoulder. "You've been here almost 20 hours. "I know," Emily said, not moving. "I'll leave when he's not looking at the door every 5 seconds. The nurse didn't argue, just nodded and walked away. That night, as the hospital lights dimmed and the corridor quieted again, Liam finally leaned against her arm. Not for long, not even fully, but just enough. Just long enough for her to feel the weight of his head rest there, trusting, without words. Emily didn't move. Whatever was coming, whoever was on their way, she would be here. Not because it was her job, because it was her promise. It was nearly midnight when the silence broke. The night staff had thinned, the pediatric wing dimmed for rest, and only the soft beep of machines kept time. Emily sat in her usual place beside Liam, half awake, gently rubbing her thumb along the edge of her coffee cup when she noticed the shift. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of one, the kind that made your skin tighten a second before your brain understood why. Down the hallway, footsteps echoed, measured, deliberate, heavier than sneakers or clogs. Military boots. Emily stood instinctively and stepped into the corridor just as the elevator doors slid open. A man in full uniform emerged, tall, broad-shouldered. Crisp creases in his fatigues, his chest decorated with insignia she didn't recognize but instantly respected. He moved with a purpose that made even the seasoned night nurse at the desk sit up straighter. Without a glance at anyone else, the man walked directly to the administrator's office, a sealed envelope in his gloved hand. He knocked once, sharp and singular. Within seconds, the door opened and closed behind him, swallowing the moment in complete silence again. Emily didn't move, but her heart raced. She looked back toward room 409. Liam hadn't stirred. Not yet. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The officer emerged without a word, still expressionless, and disappeared into the elevator just as quickly as he came. But something lingered in his wake, an unspoken gravity that clung to the walls like static. Emily waited until the administrator's office door opened. Margaret stood there, holding the envelope as if it were made of glass. Her face was pale, her mouth pressed in a tight line. When she saw Emily, she didn't speak right away, just gave a small nod as though saying, "You were right to stay." Emily stepped closer. "Is it?" she asked quietly, her eyes flicking toward the envelope. Margaret hesitated. Then she handed it over. The seal was thick, marked with an emblem Emily didn't recognize. Dark ink against ivory paper. Heavy. Official. She didn't open it. She couldn't. Not yet. "It's for you," Margaret said simply. "They said you'd understand why." Emily looked down at it, then toward room 409, where Liam still slept with the patch gripped in his hand. She understood. This wasn't just a message. It was the beginning of something Liam had been waiting for, without even knowing it. And whatever it said, it would change everything. The envelope sat unopened in her lap for nearly half an hour before Emily gathered the nerve to break the seal. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, the kind used for official directives. At the top, the emblem of the United States Department of Defense was stamped in deep ink. Beneath it, a line that made her stomach drop. Subject: minor dependent of MIA officer, immediate relocation order approved. Liam was being moved. Not just to another room or a different wing, but off-site. Transferred to a secure location under federal protection until further review of his custodial status. No details, no destination, just a time. 0600 hours. Just 4 hours from now. Emily stared at the page, the words blurring. He didn't know. He was still asleep, curled up under the blanket with the stuffed dog and the sketchbook tucked at his side. And now someone, somewhere, had decided he'd be taken away again. Quietly, surgically, without warning. Margaret found her sitting in the hallway, directive in hand, face pale. "They say it's for his safety," she said gently. "It's not up for debate." Emily didn't answer. She stood and walked back into room 409, the door clicking softly behind her. She sat beside Liam and reached for his hand. He stirred but didn't wake. His fingers tightened around hers. She sat there until the sun began to push against the edges of the window blinds. At 5:45 a.m., two men in dark suits arrived, neither in uniform, but with credentials that were beyond reproach. They asked for the boy, their voices low, practiced, efficient. Margaret turned to Emily. "They're ready." Emily stood her ground. "No." The word surprised even her. It was quiet, but firm. One of the men tilted his head. "Ma'am, this has been approved at the highest level. The child is being relocated for his protection. You are not authorized to interfere." "I'm not interfering," she said. "I'm staying." They exchanged a look. "You're not assigned to accompany him." "I don't care." Her voice cracked then, just a little. "He doesn't know where you're taking him. He doesn't even know why. And you want to pull him from the only place he feels safe without letting him say goodbye." She stepped forward, eyes burning. "I won't let you do that to him. Not again." A long silence followed. One of the agents pulled out a phone, made a hushed call, murmured words she couldn't make out. When he returned, his expression had shifted, reluctant but resigned. "You may accompany him to the vehicle," he said, "but no further." Emily looked down at Liam. He was awake now, staring up at her, already sensing the change. She crouched beside him, brushing a hand over his blanket. "You're going somewhere safe," she whispered, "but I'm coming with you, at least as far as they'll let me." He didn't speak, but his small hand reached for hers, tight and certain. She wouldn't let go, not until someone made her. And even then, not without a fight. The storm didn't come with thunder or lightning. It came with radios crackling to life, clipped voices over secure channels, and a sudden swarm of unfamiliar faces moving with quiet urgency through the hospital's sterile halls. By mid-morning, the entire pediatric wing had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough that anyone paying attention could feel it. Uniformed personnel appeared at the entrance, standing at precise intervals. No weapons visible, but their presence alone made every nurse stand a little straighter, speak a little softer. Emily watched it all from the window of room 409, her arms folded, heart pounding. Margaret approached her mid-shift with a grim expression. "They've raised the security protocol. Possible threat connected to the boy's relocation." "What kind of threat?" Emily asked, her voice low. Margaret hesitated. "They won't say. Just that there's chatter. Someone outside the system might know who Liam is, or what his father was part of." Emily turned to look at the boy, who was sitting quietly at the table now, drawing again, completely unaware of the low-voltage panic building just outside his door. He didn't need to know. Not yet. "I don't want anyone near him," Emily said. "Not unless it's absolutely necessary." Margaret gave a slow nod. "You've got until the transfer. After that, it's out of our hands." By noon, the perimeter of the hospital was being monitored. Cars entering the parking lot were screened, badges double-checked. Patients on the floor were kept in their rooms. The sense of calm the hospital usually tried to preserve was fraying at the edges. Emily stayed with Liam the whole time. She helped him pack his few belongings, his sketchbook, the stuffed dog, the worn patch he kept folded in his pocket like a talisman. She didn't rush him. Let him choose what to keep. Let him fold his drawings with care. Outside, the hospital murmured with tension. Inside room 409, Emily tried to protect the silence. Liam looked up once, his eyes catching hers. "Are we leaving?" he asked. It was the first time he'd asked a question aloud. Emily crouched beside him, steadying her voice. Soon, but you're not alone. Not now. Not ever. He nodded, his lip trembling just slightly before he tucked it in tight. She knew that look, the look of someone bracing against uncertainty with all the strength a child could manage. The calm hadn't come yet, but Emily would stay through the storm, because sometimes the only shelter a child has is a person who refuses to leave. The sky was still gray when Emily pulled into the hospital lot, the morning mist hugging the pavement like a veil. But what stopped her cold wasn't the weather. It was the line of military vehicles, dark and gleaming, stretching across the front of the building like an armored wall. Black SUVs, jeeps with mounted antennas. A transport van, each one marked only by discreet government plates and a sense of purpose that crackled like static in the air. She parked at the far edge, heart thudding. Men in uniform, some in dress blues, others in plain fatigues, stood in formation near the entrance. They weren't moving, just waiting. Watchful. Intent. Emily stepped out slowly, her badge already clipped to her coat, though she doubted it would matter much today. She walked past the security checkpoint, where two soldiers nodded to her, not unkindly, but with the tight expressions of people managing something delicate. Inside, the hospital buzzed with quiet tension. The usual morning rush had dulled to a whisper. Nurses whispered in corners. Staff exchanged glances instead of greetings, and the pediatric wing had become the eye of it all. When she reached room 409, the door was already open. Liam sat fully dressed, his small backpack on the chair, stuffed dog poking out from the zipper. He didn't look scared, just still, as if he'd known this day was coming and had finally decided to stop outrunning it. "You're early," he said softly, surprising her again with his voice. "So are you," Emily replied, managing a small smile. She stepped inside and shut the door behind her, blocking out the tension that pulsed through the corridor. She crouched to his level. "Do you know what today is?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "The day I leave." Her chest ached, but she nodded. "Yes, but it's also the day everything changes, in a good way." He looked down, twisting the strap of his backpack. Emily reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote you something," she said, placing it in his hand. "You don't have to read it now, but maybe later, when things feel a little less scary." He took it carefully, then glanced up. "Will I see you again?" She blinked, the question striking deeper than she expected. "I hope so," she whispered. "But even if you don't, you were never invisible, not to me." A quiet knock interrupted them. One of the officers stood at the door, hat in hand. "It's time." Emily rose, brushing her hand gently over Liam's shoulder. "I'll walk with you." And together, they stepped into the hallway, into the silence, into the stairs, into the waiting morning where something bigger than either of them had begun to unfold. The hospital door slid open, not with ceremony, but with a hushed click, like the building itself knew something sacred was about to happen. Emily stood just behind Liam, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, the morning light pouring through the glass and casting long shadows on the sterile floor. At first, there was only the sound of boots, steady, deliberate, echoing against the tile. Then the shape appeared, tall and lean, wearing a uniform dulled by dust and weeks of travel. The soldier's face was lined with exhaustion, beard scruff clinging to a jaw that had once been clean-cut, eyes scanning the room with a mix of disbelief and urgency. Liam didn't speak. He didn't ask. He didn't even look back at Emily. He just ran. The stuffed dog fell from his grip as he bolted down the corridor, shoes thudding unevenly against the floor. The soldier froze as Liam approached, and for a breathless second, Emily thought maybe he wouldn't recognize him. But then his knees hit the floor. "Liam," the soldier whispered, arms wide open. The boy crashed into him, arms wrapping tight around his neck, burying his face into the uniform he'd been dreaming of for months. The man's hands shook as he held him, one on the back of his son's head, the other pressed protectively to his spine, as if to say never again. Emily stood back, blinking fast, her throat tight. "I thought you were gone," Liam said into his father's chest, the words muffled by tears. "I almost was," the man replied, voice cracking. "But I promised I'd come back, and I meant it." There were murmurs behind them, doctors, officers, staff all frozen in place, watching a moment that didn't belong to anyone but the two of them. No one dared speak. No one moved. Emily caught the eye of Colonel Reeves, standing a few feet away, his posture stiff with emotion. He gave her a nod, a silent acknowledgement. She had kept the promise that someone else had made. She had held the line. Liam pulled back slightly, his hands still gripping his father's collar. "Miss Emily stayed with me. Every night." The soldier looked up at her then, his face softened, eyes shining. "Thank you," he said simply. Emily smiled, tears welling in her eyes. He didn't need much, just someone who didn't leave. Father and son embraced again, tighter this time. And for the first time since room 409 became more than just a room, Emily let herself believe the war, at least for this boy, was finally over. The corridor had returned to its usual rhythm, monitors beeping, nurses moving from room to room, the scent of antiseptic gently lingering in the air. But in the conference room just off the pediatric wing, something different hung in the atmosphere. It wasn't tension, it was reverence. Colonel Thomas Hayes stood across from Emily, his dress uniform pristine despite the lines of fatigue around his eyes. He wasn't the man who had cradled a child minutes ago, breaking open with love and relief. Now he stood in the posture of command, shoulders squared, back straight, but his voice, when he spoke, was quiet. Human. "You didn't have to do what you did," he said, looking directly at her. "No one would have blamed you for walking away. Most people did." Emily held his gaze. "He was just a kid, left in a hospital room with no answers. I couldn't ignore that." Hayes nodded slowly. "You didn't just protect him, you preserved his dignity, and that's a kind of service most people never recognize." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, metal, round and gleaming softly in the light. He extended it to her, a Special Forces challenge coin, engraved with his unit's insignia on one side, and on the other, 3 words, Semper Vigilans, always watchful. "For exceptional service," he said. "We usually give this to men and women who've completed acts of bravery in the field. But today, it belongs to you." Emily took it, her hand trembling slightly. "I'm not a soldier." "No," he agreed. "But you were his shield." There was a beat of silence between them, one where the weight of everything unsaid hovered. The nights Emily spent sitting beside a boy she didn't know, the drawings left like breadcrumbs, the whispered "daddy" in the dark. The battles she fought, not with bullets, but with presence. Hayes glanced out the window, where Liam now stood with 2 officers, laughing quietly, one hand still clutching the dog Emily had given him months ago. "He talks about you," Hayes said. "Not just what you did, who you were. You didn't try to fix him. You just stayed, and sometimes that's the hardest thing." Emily swallowed past the tightness in her throat. "I just wanted him to feel safe." "He did," Hayes said. "Because of you, he never stopped believing his father would come home." They stood for another quiet moment, and then he extended his hand. She took it firmly. And just like that, it was done. Not an ending, but a turning point. The moment when the quiet work of kindness met the roaring truth of recognition, Emily didn't need applause. She didn't want medals. But the coin in her hand, the look in the colonel's eyes, and the boy down the hall who now laughed instead of hiding, those were enough. She had come full circle. And in doing so, so had Liam. The morning Liam left, the room felt strangely still, not empty, but settled, like a breath finally released after being held for too long. Emily stood in the doorway of room 409, watching as the last of his things were packed into a simple duffel bag. The sketchbook, the stuffed dog with its worn fur, the Special Forces patch now safely pinned to the strap. Liam glanced back only once, offering her a soft, tired smile. Not the smile of a scared child clinging to safety, but one of quiet gratitude. A boy who had been seen, heard, and finally held. Colonel Hayes placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him down the hall. They didn't look back again. They didn't need to. Emily stood for a long time after they were gone. The silence wasn't hollow. It was peaceful. But something about it made her heart ache. By that afternoon, room 409 had been scrubbed clean. The sheets changed, the monitors reset, the night lamp turned off. But when a new pediatric patient was scheduled to arrive the following week, a quiet conversation unfolded among the nurses. "Not there," they said. "Not in that room." It wasn't superstition. It was respect. A few days later, Margaret stopped by Emily's station with a small brass plaque in her hand. She didn't say anything, just handed it over. Emily read the inscription slowly. Room 409, reserved for the forgotten. A place where no child waits alone. They mounted it on the wall beside the door, right at a child's eye level. From then on, room 409 became something different. When a scared child arrived in the middle of the night with no family, that's where they were placed. Nurses volunteered to take shifts sitting with them, a practice quietly known as pulling an Emily. Some even kept pencils and paper in the drawer, just in case. No one ever officially designated it the Room of Hope, but that's what everyone called it. Parents asked for it when their children were nervous. Staff who transferred in learned about it through stories passed over lunch trays and long shifts. And those who knew the full tale spoke of it with reverence. How a boy without a voice found it in drawings, how a nurse stayed past every scheduled hour, and how, one morning, soldiers arrived not to reclaim, but to honor. Emily never told the whole story, not to coworkers, not to curious reporters when the story leaked online and swirled through military forums. She simply kept the challenge coin in her pocket and the final sketch Liam had left behind, 2 stick figures holding hands, standing in a room with a glowing window. Hope drawn in pencil. And every night, as she passed room 409 on her rounds, she paused for a second, hand brushing the plaque, heart steady with the reminder. Kindness didn't need an audience, it just needed a place to stay.